We all have experienced great leaders. We've also all experienced some toxic leaders. And we all know and have experienced the impact of those leaders. And so we as a business are passionate about organizations and helping organizations and leaders to get better impact out of themselves, to support organizations to be high performing. And so the question is, and this is often posed to us, is what is impact? How do you as a leader generate the greatest impact for leaders? And I suppose it depends on how you define impact. But if we had to define impact as an impact where a leader creates a long-term constructive memory for people of the people that they've led, that leads to them thinking differently and being different, then I would say that's a constructive impact. That's a really great constructive impact. And so then the question then is, what is it that would generate that level of impact? Is it knowledge? Is it experience? Is it wisdom? Is it care? What is it? What element generates the greatest impact for a leader? And what we fundamentally believe is what generates impact is vulnerability. And there's a lot of work that's been done around vulnerability. Brené Brown has written fantastic books and done some work around leadership and vulnerability. And we too believe that vulnerability is the foundation of impact. So let's explore a little bit about what is it that we mean by vulnerability and how is a leader vulnerable in a workplace. So for me, there's 5 elements. And the first element of vulnerability is around self-awareness. And when a leader is seeking to be vulnerable, the way to be vulnerable is essentially by understanding their strengths, their weaknesses, their flaws, which essentially stimulates self-awareness. And we know for sure that when people are self-aware, that lifts performance. They understand their strengths, understand their weaknesses, and as a result can then do things differently, whatever they need to do to get better at stuff. And so self-awareness is a foundation of high performance. So when we seek vulnerability, we're essentially facilitating the awareness of ourselves, and then from that we start sharing that outwardly. So that's the first step, and we see that leaders who are more vulnerable are also more self-aware. When then leaders now start sharing that vulnerability is essentially the equivalent of showing your underbelly. It's where we expose our flaws. It's where we talk about our weaknesses, we talk about our concerns, our worries. And when we do that, we essentially are entrusting people with that knowledge. We are giving them the choice of being trustworthy with that information. And what's in our experience is interesting is that when you give people trust, when you give them a choice of being trustworthy, most people are trustworthy. Most people step up and are trustworthy. And that's what we start seeing, is that as leaders start being now more vulnerable, we start shifting the level of trust. I start trusting more. People start trusting me more. We see this shift in trust. And trust ultimately, and we know this from all the research and evidence around organizations and trust, that trust delivers high performance in the long term. When leaders now start being consistently more vulnerable, what we now start seeing is a collective vulnerability. And a collective vulnerability is as a result of a leader who now, not just a once-off vulnerability, not just a superficial vulnerability, but is genuinely vulnerable on a consistent level. Their team members now start trusting that this vulnerability is not a manipulation, it's just real, genuine, authentic vulnerability. And they themselves now start being more vulnerable, which then leads to them being more self-aware. And we start seeing now this collective shift in vulnerability across a team, an organization. And the impact of that shift of vulnerability, that collective vulnerability, is we now start seeing different conversations. We start seeing deeper conversations. We start sharing more personal stuff with people. We start connecting with people on a whole nother level. Our feedback, when we give positive feedback now, is really genuine positive feedback, and our negative feedback is clear, it's direct, but it's done with care. And so what we now start seeing is now people start being more self-aware, the communication's clearer, more efficient, much more constructive, feedback's clearer, and now we start seeing a significant shift, not only in self-awareness, but now also in performance. We start seeing the whole organization start changing. So the impact of that collective vulnerability is massive. And then we also then see, as a result of that now collective vulnerability, people now really beginning to get the best out of themselves. You start seeing the best selves. We see the leaders being the best selves. We see their team members being the best selves. And when we have an organization, a team, where everyone is the best selves, that's when we now see sustainable high performance. And so when you ask the question, what is it that generates the greatest impact as a leader? What's going to generate that long-lasting, constructive memory of a leader? It's a leader who is vulnerable, a leader who generates trust in their people, a leader that generates a collective vulnerability that changes the way people communicate at a whole nother level. And so that's impact. I observe essentially 4 types of leaders. One leader who is not vulnerable at all, doesn't share anything, and the impact of that leader is low trust. I see a second type of leader who does what I call superficial vulnerability. Superficial vulnerability is where I share stuff, but it's scripted. So it's not authentic. And unfortunately, while it's an attempt at vulnerability, it's not a genuine attempt, and people don't trust that either. Third is I see leaders who now realize that vulnerability is useful, it is impactful, it does build trust, and they start experimenting with vulnerability. It's perhaps not as deep as it could be, but it's still, at least it's a really good start. And then you get these leaders who absolutely, authentically and genuinely are vulnerable. They share their strengths, they share their weaknesses, they share their fears, their concerns. And the impact of those leaders is enormous. This massive constructive impact where we see trust and we see engagement and we see increased effort, increased self-awareness, better performance long term. So if you're a leader watching this talk and listening to this talk, I'd like you to pause for a moment and reflect on what is your level of vulnerability with your team? How much are you sharing? Do you share your strengths, your weaknesses, your worries, your concerns? And maybe it's worth experimenting with being a little bit more vulnerable, because we truly believe that leaders and organizations that embrace vulnerability absolutely have the greatest impact and the greatest high performance long term.